Renee, I want to bring in another expert here to help us explore this issue. I'd like to welcome Cathy O'Neill to our show. She is a renowned data scientist and author of the book Weapons of Math Destruction, which is about how algorithms are increasingly used in ways that reinforce pre-existing inequalities. Thank you so much for joining us, Cathy.
It's my pleasure. Thanks for having me.
So I'd like you to begin by talking about the origin story of your research and what led you to look into this.
It's a little different from Renee's story, I guess. Well, the truth is I was a math nerd, pretty uneducated in concepts of like sociological concepts of like inequality and bias and just pure math. But then I went into finance and was a quant during the crisis, so I like saw firsthand how like bad algorithms could really, especially if they were overly trusted. I did spend a lot of time, a few years, thinking that like better math would solve this problem, like better risk models. And then realized, as Renee was mentioning, that it's a question of trust more than math. That people didn't really want the best models, the people who were selling these products, they just wanted other people, they wanted them to be good enough to be trusted by other people so that they could make money. So I left, um, and I became a data scientist, and it was like this new world of big data. But what I noticed very quickly is that the sort of explicit goal of online advertising, which is what I was now doing, was to segregate people by class, gender, and race, and to allow predatory for-profit colleges to go after like single black women with mothers by promising them a better life, specifically targeting people that were poor enough to like to be eligible for financial aid, but not savvy enough to know that this was a scam. I lost faith, did my own research, and wrote a book. Very short version. Now I have a algorithmic auditing company that actually the only real job I have is to say, A, don't trust a system just because it's based on data, because data embeds historical bias and historical practice, and B, like, for whom does your algorithm fail?
What you just described as these pernicious algorithms, these weapons of math destruction. How can you delve into a little bit more how they create these feedback loops, which, as you said, they know what they're doing?
They're not defined as creating feedback loops. It's just an observation that weapons of math destruction, which are defined with three characteristics, happen to engender destructive society level feedback loops. The three characteristics, this is how you define them, are that they are important, widespread, important. They decide somebody's opportunities, basically financial, usually, or like, or sometimes literally like how long they're sentenced to prison. So very important things to people, to a lot of people. They're secret, like they don't understand their score, they can't appeal their score. There's like no accountability really of the scoring system. And then the third thing is that they are unfair. So unfair to individuals. But as you point out, they do tend to take on this fourth characteristic, which is that they don't just destroy an individual's life by denying them something they deserve or forcing upon them something they don't want and don't deserve, but they actually destroyed the very thing that they claim to be fixing. So, for example, with education, we had this accountability movement for teachers. The idea was like, we're going to close the achievement gap by getting rid of bad teachers. Well, we ended up with something which was basically a random number generator. It wasn't a good model. It was very inconsistent, almost random, and was only applied to teachers of poor kids in urban school settings. Was created this arbitrary system of getting fired. And the end result not only was unfair for those teachers who were living in fear of getting fired by a random number generator, but it didn't at all solve the problem of getting rid of bad teachers. Because guess what? The good teachers left. They were like, heck, I don't need to work in a place like this. I can go to the suburbs or to a private school, or I could just retire. And now we have a national teacher shortage. It didn't solve the problem. It made the problem worse. That's a kind of destructive feedback loop I'm mentioning.
Okay, all right. So, as Renee was talking about earlier, we are all living through this devastating global pandemic. Can you talk a little bit about what you're seeing in terms of the interplay between this global health emergency and the algorithmic bias?
In the world of like contact tracing apps, where like the techno optimists of the first type that they think everything is helpful, like really were like very naive and in thinking that like we were gonna all upload these Bluetooth apps and trace COVID. They don't want to know that they've been exposed because what are they going to do with that information? Stay home for 2 weeks? They're not going to. They need the money. It's like we have no functioning contact tracing apps because the very people, the service workers, the critical workers who are most exposed are the least likely to adopt the apps. We need an FDA for algorithms that before deploying a new important algorithm, and there has to be some legal definition of important, which I'm not a lawyer, so I don't know it, but like it's going to affect a lot of people in important ways. So we have to ask, for whom does this fail? Like, for whom does this deliver algorithmic harm? And really make a study of that and define what it means to be acceptable harm for Black people, for women, for people, for older people, for disabled people, etc., protected classes. So that's a question of safety. And then effectiveness, I would argue that it's like we've already overburdened algorithms, AI, with like solving problems that it can't solve. Like it can't, actually, algorithms can't assess teachers. They just can't. Like that was the wrong thinking that an algorithm just with test scores alone can decide whether a teacher is effective. No, we can't do that.
So Renee, I want to bring you into this conversation with Cathy. You said earlier you were standing on the shoulders of giants. I think Cathy is one of the giants you were referring to. Are we asking too much of algorithms? I mean, that seems to be what really this is boiling down to in a lot of ways.
Part of the cognitive biases that people hold, Cathy touched upon, right? Which is this idea that it's technological, so it's not biased, right? It's numbers, so it's objective. And these types of biases affect who's willing to deploy algorithms, right? And the solutions that we're proffering, right? This is a systemic problem, and so it requires that level of thought and oversight. And I think conversations like we're having now are conversations that should be replicated, right? Not in the halls of academia or for people like Cathy who are devoting their time and effort with her firm, but throughout everyone's firm, because there's a sort of mimetic thing that's going on here. The latest statistic says that $50 billion have been devoted by companies already toward AI, and that number is going to more than double by 2024. That's a lot of resources. That's a lot of money. And when we think about, how organizations assess competitive advantage, many of them look at what others in their field are doing. So you see this widespread adoption, and it suggests that you're behind if you don't adopt, right? Machine learning, AI, big data, all of the buzzwords that people want to be able to say when they're talking about innovation. So we have these processes that people don't necessarily think about when they think about organizations, right? They think that human beings engage in social comparison, but organizations engage in mimetic behaviors as well. And so this is why we need to encourage each organization to have these conversations within.
Cathy, finally, I want you to close this out here. Are organizations having these conversations, and are they having them deeply enough that will actually move the needle?
Whether it's bad PR or if it's lawsuits, plaintiff lawsuits or class action lawsuits, or if it's regulators getting on top of it. And who knows? Like that will happen eventually. I'm pretty sure, I'm confident that we as a society will be grappling with algorithms for a long, long time. And so we have a choice to either do whatever they want, just to say whatever their creators and deployers want, or actually say, no, you have to follow the rules just like everyone else. I think we're going to have to get to that second place. I hope it's soon.
I hope it's soon too. Thank you so much, Cathy O'Neil. So Renee, Cathy just painted a dire picture about the ways in which biases are baked into the algorithms, but your research is less about the biases in the technology and instead about the biases in humans. Tell us about some of your recent experiments.
I think it's important that people who are data scientists like Cathy look at this issue on the algorithmic side. But as a behavioral scientist, I look at this on the human side and try to understand those human cognitive biases that interplay with algorithmic biases and even, often predate them. So doing a few studies on this. One of the studies that I have done with a doctoral student at MIT, Heather Yang. In this study, we look at who trusts AI, and particularly trust in AI as a function of an individual level trait that is called cognitive style.
How do you define a person's cognitive style?
So, cognitive style and the bifurcation, if you will, of the human mind into system one and two processing has been around for quite some time, actually into the 50s. But it's been more recently popularized by research by Kahneman and Tversky, and in particular, Daniel Kahneman's book, Thinking Fast and Slow, right? So, fast thinking is your automatic processing, the thinking that you would employ, for instance, if you're driving and a deer would pop out on the road in front of your car. You would automatically slam the brakes, right? And you don't need to engage in deliberative processing to know to do that. But if you had a decision that were more complicated, for instance, a math problem, like what's 15 times 17 times 3, or if you are making a decision to choose from a very long wine list, you would employ a far more deliberative or slow thinking, right? And that thinking process would be one that would take more time and take more effort and be ostensibly less lazy than system one processing. Now, more recently, in 2008, research by Shane Frederick developed a measure of this called the cognitive reflection test. And this cognitive reflection test is a battery of questions meant to assess essentially if you're a slow or a fast thinker. And so in answering these questions, you're asked questions that are, sound kind of brain teaser like, but the purpose of this is to see how much you can resist the urge to report what appears to be at the immediate look of the question, the right answer. So fast thinkers will say, oh, yeah, the answer is obvious and answer accordingly.
Here's an example of a question on the cognitive reflection test. If the number of lily pads on a pond double every day, and it takes 30 days for them to cover the entire pond, on what day is the pond half covered? Many people answer 15 days, as that is the basic human intuition answer, but the correct answer is 29 days. People definitely have inclinations to be either a system one or a system two thinker. How does that relate to your findings in terms of who trusts AI and who is more skeptical of AI?
We found that your cognitive style is predictive of whether you will exhibit what's called algorithmic appreciation, which is your preference for an algorithmic input when making a decision over human input. And that contrasted with a phenomenon called algorithmic aversion, where you do the opposite. Given, the option, all things being held equal, a preference for human input when making a decision over algorithmic input. Now, at this time, there is a lot more algorithmic aversion generally. And that may be a feature of the fact that, algorithms are, for most people, relatively new in terms of seeking that kind of input, machine learning, and so on and so forth. But nevertheless, we find that there is, in fact, across a variety of domains, making decisions about finance, making decisions about health, hiring decisions, educational admissions decisions, and others. We find that system one dominant people exhibit algorithmic aversion. That is, they have a preference for human input over AI, whereas system two people demonstrate algorithmic appreciation. They prefer a higher proportion of AI input when making a decision. Now, mind you, this is not a binary choice. So we do give people the option of using input from both and having kind of different proportions. And that proportion could go from 0 to 100 and in between percentage of one versus the other. And so we think that maps more accurately, right, to how we live our lives every day. No one completely listens to algorithms and ignores all other human input.
What are some of your other findings about the way that these decisions are perceived by system one and system two thinkers?
These people who are system two, being people who generally hold very powerful positions in society, given these predilections, holding this bias toward algorithms may be then the very people who are most vulnerable to algorithmic bias, which is, I think, a little counterintuitive, right? That these system one people and their preference for humans may actually be something that actually reduces the amount of algorithmic bias in their lives. Whereas these system two thinkers, we need to be really careful about that, right? Because these are the people who will be making decisions that could ultimately affect all of us.
So we've established in the beginning of our program just how much bias is baked into the technology with Cathy O'Neil and the weapons of math destruction. You are now talking about the problems of trust and how certain populations are either too trusting of algorithms, and we know then the biases that are baked into those algorithms, and then there are others who are more skeptical of algorithms, which is a problem in and of itself too. What are the implications of your research for companies that are building these bots and these AI enhanced experiences? A lot of companies, for example, are using algorithms in their hiring and promotion practices. What do you see as some of the biggest implications for the technology companies, Renee?
I think there are a few lessons to take away from this. I think one is to be skeptical in terms of assessing the potential damage right away, and not to sort of view algorithms as a panacea or as neutral. Many people think if it can be quantified, then it's objective. And I don't think we can actually make that assumption. So I think one of the implications is to really have systems in place within organizations that audit these issues and that test when and for whom these algorithms fail or present problems. I think another implication of this, you mentioned that algorithms being used in hiring practices and things of that nature. There are a lot of people who look at algorithms as being a partner to humans, and that their role would be to correct the biases that humans have, right? So we know that humans have cognitive biases, and these algorithms will come in and sort of recalibrate and help us, make better decisions and be better ourselves. And I don't think that assumption is one that we should operate under. I think rather we should be sort of more systemic in understanding the implications of AI and looking at when humans can augment these artificial intelligence systems and vice versa. And I'm working on a book that looks at this very thing, right? To understand this integration and when we can get to the best of both worlds, right? As opposed to assuming that algorithms will solve those problems for us. And so I'm doing research right now with Dave Rand at MIT and Zvi Epstein at MIT, looking at this very issue, looking at when you include algorithms in decision making and the bias is found in the outcome, to what extent do people give a pass because an algorithm was involved?
I want to bring in another expert to help us unpack this issue. I want to welcome Cathy Baxter to the show. She is the principal architect of the ethical AI practice at Salesforce. She can tell us a little bit more about how large companies like Salesforce are wrestling with this issue. Welcome to the show, Cathy.
Hi, thank you for having me.
So I want to start by asking you a little bit about your role at Salesforce. What was the impetus for Salesforce starting an ethical AI practice?
In 2016, Mark Benioff, our co-founder and CEO, announced that we were going to become an AI-driven company. And one of the first AI solutions that I worked on were our chatbots. It was, for me, like going down a rabbit hole of figuring out all of the different ways that bias and harm ends up being baked into AI. AI really is a mirror of society. It has the potential to address bias in many of our decision making, but we have to be incredibly cognizant of that to be able to mitigate it and not perpetuate it. So I started working more and more with our Einstein teams. Einstein is our AI platform, and thinking about how bias might be baked into AI for our service and sales and marketing products. And by about summer of 2018, it had become like a full-time job, just without the title.
So what is your day-to-day like? What kinds of issues are you working on? What are you thinking about? Salesforce is such a powerful and influential company because its platform is interwoven with so many other organizations around the country. But with that comes a responsibility to lead on these issues. What's your day-to-day like? What are you thinking about?
Absolutely. We take that responsibility very seriously. I think one of the reasons why it was pretty easy to make a case for why this role was needed is because of our core values as a company. The number one value is trust, and number two is customer success. We spend a lot of time educating our employees to ask the questions of not just can we do this, but should we do this? What are the unintended consequences of what we are creating? Who are all of the individuals that are going to be impacted, and what might that look like? So really doing risk assessments in what we are creating, and then thinking about all of these different mitigation strategies. Because we are a platform, we don't see our customers' data, we don't touch our customers' data.
As we know from Renee and her research, and we also know from Cathy O'Neill, these biases are systemic. What is some of the advice you would have for some of your peers who are also wrestling with these issues? What are some best practices that have emerged?
So we really have to look at how representative is that data. And we can never make an assumption. We can never say that data or the model itself is bias free. There are all of these unknown unknowns. There are ways that you can examine a model for bias, but it's never going to be complete. So when it comes to analyzing by gender, we could analyze by male and female, but we know that gender is a spectrum. And so if you're only looking at it in this binary way, you're baking in a different kind of bias. But the more factors you add in to analyze the data, the more complex it gets to try to balance it out. So it just becomes a really difficult statistical problem to solve. I'm not saying that we shouldn't do it, but if we're not doing that level of work, we can't say that this is unbiased.
Renee, I want to bring you in here a little bit and just get your take on what Cathy is saying. And we were hearing now how a global corporation is thinking about these issues and how it's wrestling with them and grappling with them. What's your take as someone who studies this as an academic when you hear about how in the real world this is being thought about and approached?
Well, there were a couple of things that Cathy said that I feel like many more people need to hear. You know, transparency around what are the assumptions in the model, what data are being used, what is the purpose. That transparency is really important because we have an information asymmetry here. We have the data scientists who are working on these algorithms, and then we have the people whose lives will be affected. And the data scientists may know the nitty-gritty of the recipe, but the people who are eating the output, so to speak, don't know what's in there. That's a problem. We need to figure out a way to make this less idiosyncratic and make this more systemic. And so there are multiple ways in which we can do this. I think that firms like Salesforce that are influential have the ability and the responsibility, right, to use their outsized influence in this way and to educate their clients and their customers in this. I think, Cathy O'Neill's firm in auditing is going to be critical. I think there's a tremendous amount of information asymmetry in terms of the government. And if there is going to be and should be regulation to help the population, we're going to need those people to really understand what's going on in the black box. On my end, within academia, there's my research. And I try to do research that's not going to just, be read by 15 people somewhere who are already kind of into this. But I think, platforms like this that would share it with a broader audience, that's critical, right? We can make data visualization and make these issues clear and widespread. People will have information that's empowering. I have a customer experience course that I'm launching in January, and we have a module that is about this very thing. And we will, bring in practitioners, but also talk about these issues so that you don't just get rubber stamped with, okay, you're the latest and greatest, decision maker in this field, but that we center the humans in our algorithmically mediated systems. And by centering the humans and by understanding the systems that constrain, but also, I think empower humans, we will do a better job at improving those systems and rooting out bias when we can.
Cathy, and Renee too, this pandemic that we're all living through, the social unrest this spring and summer that followed the deaths of George Floyd and Ahmaud Arbery and Breonna Taylor. Is this reckoning that we're having as a country, is it extending into this deeper understanding of the biases that are baked into the technology that we have, and also the biases that are lurking around in us human beings? I mean, what do you think? In the end, are you optimistic we'll be able to solve this problem? As Cathy said, AI is a mirror of society for all its goodness and all its evil. Where are you feeling optimistic that we'll be able to solve this exceedingly complex problem? I want to start with you, Cathy.
Yeah, one of the things that I was very happy about was to see more and more articles in the popular press about the racial bias in facial recognition. This has been something that folks in our field have known about for a very long time, but the message just hadn't gotten out there to the broader public. And so far we've been talking about bias in the training data and the business processes for how that's developed, and then the model itself, what are the factors that you use. But the next piece of it is, how do you apply that AI system and to whom?
Right? Nobody should have to make the choice between, doing what's healthy for them in COVID, for example, and having their privacy and their data be sold and used against them. This is not right. So this reckoning, I think, is a really important situation for us to be heightened and thinking about, hang on here. What are we building? And should we use it this way? And until we start to ask those questions, we'll be in automatic mode. We'll be checking our boxes, we'll be getting our projects done, and then we'll step back afterward and ask, what have we done here? So now is the time. And conversations like this and what Cathy is doing at Salesforce and the questions Cathy O'Neill has raised, this is the time to have this conversation. And this is the time that we need to start centering humans of different backgrounds, right? Of different lifestyles, of different experiences, because those who are most vulnerable are being left behind even faster as technology and digital transformation accelerates.
It's almost human-centered, but humanity-centered. That wraps up our conversation. Thank you so much, Renee and Cathy, for joining us on this edition of the MIT Sloan Expert Series. And thank you, too, for watching. We hope to see you next time.